Okay, well, we've addressed this group many, many times in the last 5 years with the AGGP project. So just to remind everybody, and for those who are new, what we were trying to set out with the CAP Agri Assurance application was do the proof of concept on the ground with the climate action reserves approved Canadian grassland, avoided conversion of grasslands protocol. So, the AGGP program set out to gather funding and decide if the enough science was in place to be able to put in some sort of improved forage management, rotational grazing type of protocol. There wasn't enough science. We pivoted. We took the abandoned avoided conversion of grasslands protocol from the Ontario-Quebec process that Premier Doug Ford kind of, pulled the plug on and deployed it back into the Climate Action Reserve as a voluntary Canadian protocol. So there's the context. And because it's the voluntary market, we were looking at ways that we could pilot for 2 years to improve things so that we had a more streamlined process and didn't pull a lot of value out from the carbon being generated from just the complex processes that are in the protocol. So that was what we set out to do. And we always had our sights on the compliance carbon offset systems in Canada. It's on the list of the to-do list of Environment Canada Climate Change OBPS offset program. So it's, I think, listed in the third tranche or the second tranche. Don't quote me. I think it might be the second tranche. And then we applied again in Alberta, 4th year in a row, for intent to develop a protocol for the tier regulation, and we just got refused again. But try again. We'll keep going. Elements of this protocol were what we presented to the regulators at Alberta Environment and Parks and Jackie Mercer's team in Environment Canada Climate Change. There are a few other folks that were on the call as well, Robin Bloom and others who many of you are familiar with. Just remind everybody, we've got a lot of partners in this pilot. The land trust companies are pretty significant here because one of the requirements is to have a qualified conservation easement to be able to guarantee permanence of the offsets, which, as we know, many of you have been studying, offset criteria is a pretty important offset criteria. So we've got a whole cast of experts and trust organizations to be able to deploy and test this proof of concept. A critical point is that the assumption is that the grassland will be converted to annual cropping in the baseline. So we're calculating the avoided loss of carbon and the avoided nitrogen fertilizer emissions that would have occurred if it was converted to annual cropping. It's always a bit of a brain calisthenic to get your head wrapped around this mechanism, but they're assessing the risk of conversion is really fundamental to proving out another important concept or criteria for offsets, which is additionality. And I think, it's safe to say that we've never had an avoided conversion protocol in Canada in any compliance market. That was one of the concerns of the rejection 4th year in a row, even though we were invited to reapply. And we'll see. I mean, if Environment Canada Climate Change is going to be brave enough to move forward, be wonderful to entertain an avoided conversion. I think the voices are getting time about irrecoverable carbon. The Nature United report was talking about Canada's natural climate solution pathways. The recent WWF report about the amount of carbon stored in Canada's grasslands, boreal forest, and peatlands. You lose those things, they're gone. They're irrecoverable. And there's so many other things that go with them. So the voices are getting louder. I'm confident that if we keep trying, that we will get there. So here's a summary that we sort of compiled for the regulators in what we have learned in our first year. And so we're kind of hitting the touch points that we know are their niggly pain points. So, of course, we're saying the science is in our national emissions inventory. It's one of those things that both Alberta Environment and Environment Canada Climate Change are saying it's got to be in our inventory. Gas activity. Additionality, Well, we're proving out how well these assumptions hold in Canada for the additionality, which is the risk of conversion. What is the difference between the valuation and appraisal of the land under cow-calf and the land under cropping? And we don't have published rental rates like the US has. So we have to go to appraisers. And it's one of those things that we're trying to figure out how we do this in a more streamlined and less costly way. Permanence, of course, that's the big one, right? And difficult because it's got to be 100 years, perpetuities, but there are shorter term easements that are, Saskatchewan Stock Growers has got funding to test shorter term easements. So we've built that into the permanence accounting of the protocol. We want to test it. I don't think anybody's going to go for it because you get a fraction of the amount of the carbon awarded to you each year, maybe 20% of a ton each year, but you don't have to worry about permanence for 100 years. So we're trying to test those things. We're testing other things as well on the ground for verification. Some of the details still do require some refinement, so we'll be focusing on that in the next year. And how do we practically do this without having to go out and visit the landscape? There's so many tools coming online that, you don't need to do that on a regular basis, but ecosystem health assessments or the rangeland health assessments, we're working on how we might be able to detect that with remote sensing with some of the partners on this group. So the key findings, these are quite detailed. I'll circulate this afterwards because there's tons of slides for extra slides for people who haven't been along for the ride and want to learn a little bit more about what we're trying to do. But we're finding that land appraisals, it would be nice if we could source some rental rates. We're working back and forth with Climate Action Reserve, which is the program authority, and they're being very flexible and saying, okay, well, if there's other ways you could do it, let's be open to that. And the rate of conversion in a given region might be a better indicator of risk. We certainly have tracking on rate of conversion now, new tools coming out. WWF has a cropland, what's it called? The crop footprint. I can't remember the name of that site. I think it's on a slide, but they actually show the conversion of, perennial to annual on a very visual way in the remote sensing tools that they have access to. It's quite good. The suitability for cropping, we're looking at those. So a lot of things that we want to test in the next year. The permanence, the short term versus the long term. That's another one that we may not be able to get funding all the time for. It could be a barrier. Obviously, conservation easement funding is not easy to come by. So how do we raise that awareness? Quantification. We did include the mosaic of the landscape in the Climate Action Reserve protocol. So uplands and lowlands. And we're trying to figure out how we get that quantification, working with Pascal Badiot and company at Ducks to get that wetlands quantification built in there, because we know we don't have the ability to stack right now. There's no wetlands protocol, and it's a bit of a political quagmire in Alberta. The project development, learning a lot about this, how we streamline, how we get things, sharing across the entities, whether it's a project developer and a land trust, what's the best way, most efficient way to do that? And then looking at sort of the potential here for offset revenue for landowners. We know that this right now is the voluntary market. The voluntary market is creeping up. There's some exchanges that are emerging, like the CML and the CBE. And when you have the NBS type offsets, they're selling at twice the rate of the normal offsets. So in the clearing in December, there was like $8 a ton. Now it's up to $16 a ton for the NBS ones. So it's creeping up there. And I just see this rising because there's not a lot of supply in the NBS space, especially from land-based forestry, yes, but not this. And then testing the Climate Action Reserve process, it seems to work. So next steps, this coming year, more testing on the cropland premium, looking at can we do GIS risk-based assessment, right? On tracking the risk of conversion with real evidence that is historical to be able to build that. The ecosystem health assessment, we're really streamlining the rangeland health assessment. into a very less intensive process. We worked with Barry Adams and Bob Thompson to do that, going out on the landscapes and getting, okay, what is that core element that we need for carbon? The feasibility of remote sensing will be tested this year as well with Regrow, a very globally renowned entity that uses satellites to track conservation practices on the ground. We do need to look at how we can streamline collecting information on fuel usage, fertilizers, and grazing animals, and kind of secondary data we can get for that, rather than going in and counting cows, if you will. Long-term monitoring requirements. So what is the relationship between the land trust organizations who have a responsibility to do that monitoring in perpetuity on those things? Testing short-term easements I talked about. Can we develop a specific easement for carbon instead of bundling so many attributes into an easement, which can burden the whole process down? The screening tool, I think I said, so we've got a grass map that we're developing with a climate action reserve, so it can be used by everybody to screen to see what lands may be eligible. A GIS-based scoping tool for credit estimation will be sort of layered on top of that. We want to improve those wetland coefficients. We're going to get that first group verified. We have 4 groups of landowners that we're going to be, over the next year putting through the project. And there's a handbook that we've been working on back and forth with the Climate Action Reserve coming out soon. So it's probably going to be a little easier than going through that 120-page technical document. I think that's it. Over to you, Cedric.
Amazing. Thank you, Karen. As always, you take a very complex topic and boil it down into reasonable language and delivery. So any questions for Karen on this one? I think, yeah, we've heard lots about this. We've had a number of workshops on this one, some awareness, I guess. Many of you had attended that back in, was it January, February? I think we had that stakeholder meeting. So
yeah, yep,
more robust updates. So consider yourself up to date, and look forward to finishing that one off this year. So thanks for being with us, Karen. I know we had a busy day